That was a legitimate interpretation by Jackson that he was being asked to seize Florida.
He then began a march on Negro Fort, 60 miles to the south.
Today, people across the nation are celebrating the legacy and heritage of Native Americans.
A place of removal for Seminole tribal members. There's a very painful history.
And they knew if they gave Andrew Jackson some latitude in his orders, he would take it.
Spanish Florida was established in the 1500s. Spain laid claim to the land known as La Florida. The Europeans brought over disease, and the Native American populations were devastated. Their population dropped over the following centuries. Over the years, Spain established a number of missions throughout the Florida territory, but Spain never fully had real control over Florida. They controlled the Spanish missions and forts. European settlements were established in St. Augustine, Pensacola, and St. Mark's. In the 1730s, Spain started a policy of providing refuge in Florida for runaway slaves in an attempt to weaken the English southern colonies. Hundreds of slaves escaped into Florida. Most of them were settled near St. Augustine and Fort Mose. A large number were also welcomed by the Seminole Indians into their tribes. It became common to find black Seminole towns and black Seminoles living with the Seminole people. During the War of 1812, the British had built a fort on the Apalachicola River. It was built in 1814 to support an attack on the U.S. via its southwest border of Florida. The attack never happened. The British withdrew after the War of 1812 in 1815. British commander Edward Nicolls left the fort intact for the use of the Indians. Instead, the fort came into possession of a band of free escaped African Americans. It was named Negro Fort by the white Americans. Word got out across the border into the plantations throughout the South. Many slaves escaped the plantations to reach the fort. The presence of a refuge for free African Americans was considered a threat to the institution of slavery in the United States. Settlers in the border states, mainly Mississippi and Georgia, accused the Seminoles of inciting slaves to escape and then stealing them as their human property. Plantation owners organized raids in Spanish Florida. They captured freed African Americans in Seminole villages near the border. This caused the Seminoles to cross into U.S. territory, raid and attack plantations near the border, and then retreat back into Spanish Florida. The Spanish had almost completely lost control of Florida. They had only a few soldiers stationed at St. Augustine, Pensacola, and St. Mark's. With tensions rising in April of 1816, General Andrew Jackson informed Governor Jose Mascot of West Florida that if the Spanish did not eliminate the fort, then he would. The governor replied and told Jackson that he did not have the forces to take down the fort. Jackson assigned General Edmund Gaines to take control of the fort. Gaines directed Colonel Clinch to build Fort Scott on the Flint River, just north of the Florida border. Gaines intended to supply the new Fort Scott via the Apalachicola River from New Orleans. This would mean passing through Spanish territory right past the fort. It would allow the U.S. Army to keep an eye on the fort, and if the fort happened to fire on the U.S. supply boats, the Americans would finally have an excuse to destroy the fort. In July of 1816, a supply fleet was headed for Fort Scott. It entered the Apalachicola River. Colonel Clinch had a force of more than 100 soldiers and 150 Lower Creek warriors. The supply fleet reached the fort, and the two gunboats took position across the river from the fort. A short time later, the fort fired their cannon. It was aimed at the U.S. soldiers and Creek warriors, but it missed. And this caused the U.S. soldiers to fire back. The gunboats fired hot shot. Hot shot was a cannonball that had been heated until it glowed red. On the gunboat's ninth shot, the cannonball landed in the fort's magazine. The heated cannonball ignited the gunpowder. The explosion that followed completely destroyed the fort. The explosion was heard more than 100 miles away in Pensacola. It had been known as the single deadliest cannon shot in American history. There were 320 people known to be inside the fort, including women and children, and more than 250 died instantly as a result of the explosion. Many, many more died from their injuries after. Diaries written by the U.S. soldiers told of dead bodies raining from the sky. Once the fort was destroyed, the army withdrew back to Fort Scott. By this time, American settlers had begun crossing the border and settling in Spanish Florida. Many Seminole villages were raided, along with their cattle. The Seminoles retaliated by stealing their cattle back. On February 24, 1817, a Seminole raiding party killed a woman known as Miss Garrett and her 2 small children in Camden County, Georgia. For many, this was the final straw. A village named Town was established in southwest Georgia, 15 miles from Fort Scott. The village claimed sovereignty to the land on the east side of the Flint River. A treaty with the Creek Indians, the Treaty of Fort Jackson, had land ceded by the Creeks, but the village was Miccosukee, and they believed the treaty did not apply to them. On November 21, 1817, General Gaines sent 200 soldiers to seize Town. The first attempt by the Americans was a complete disaster. They were beaten back, but on the second day, the Native Americans were driven out of Town. Some historians believed that this was the start of the First Seminole War. 1 week later, a boat carrying supplies to Fort Scott on the Apalachicola River was attacked. There were around 50 people on board, including 26 soldiers, 7 wives of soldiers, and possibly a few children. Most of the Americans on board were killed. 1 woman was taken prisoner, and 6 survivors made it to Fort Scott. Later reports claimed that 4 children were also killed. General Gaines had been under orders not to invade Florida, but when news of Scott's massacre reached Washington, General Gaines was ordered to invade Florida to pursue the Indians, but not to attack any Spanish installations. But when these orders arrived, General Gaines had already left for East Florida to deal with pirates who had occupied Fernandina. Secretary of War John Calhoun then ordered General Jackson to lead the invasion into Spanish Florida, with strict orders not to engage with the Spanish. General Jackson built up his forces in Fort Scott in preparation for the invasion. Jackson's forces included 800 Army regulars, 1,000 Tennessee volunteers, 1,000 Georgia militia, and about 1,400 Lower Creek warriors. Jackson's army crossed the border into Spanish Florida on March 15th. They marched down the Apalachicola River. Their first stop was the site of the exploded fort, where Jackson ordered his men to construct a new fort. Its name was Fort Gadsden. Jackson's army then headed out to present-day Tallahassee, the Indian town of Anaka. His army torched the town on March 31st. The town of Miccosukee was taken the next day. More than 300 Native Americans' homes were destroyed. Jackson turned south and headed for Fort St. Marks. The fort was under Spanish control, and Jackson reached the fort on April 6th. General Jackson wrote to the commandant of Fort St. Marks, Don Francisco Caso y Luengo. He told him that he had invaded Florida at the president's instruction, and that he had captured the wife of Chief Chenaby, and she testified that the Seminoles had been receiving their ammunition from the fort. And he explained that the fort had already been taken over by people living in the Indian towns he had already destroyed, and to prevent this from happening again, the fort would need to be guarded by American troops. Jackson justified this on the principle of self-defense, claiming that through this action he was a friend of Spain. Jackson was trying to take possession of St. Mark's by convincing the Spanish that they were allies with the Americans against the Seminole Indians. Don Luengo responded to Jackson, agreeing that him and Jackson were indeed allies, but denied the story that Chief Chenaby's wife had told. He claimed that the Seminoles had not taken any ammunition from or possessed any from the fort. He told Jackson that he was worried about the challenges he would face if he allowed American troops to occupy the fort without first getting authorization from the Spanish government. Jackson would hear none of this, and he seized St. Mark's on April 7th. Jackson found Alexander George Arbuthnot, who was a Scottish trader based in the Bahamas. He traded with the Indians in Florida. He had written letters to British and American officials on behalf of the Indians, and it was rumored that he was selling guns to the Indians and preparing them for war against the United States. He probably actually was selling guns to the Indians, since the main trade items of the Indians were deer skins, and they needed guns to hunt the deer. Two Indian leaders, Josiah Francis, a Red Stick Creek known as the Prophet, and Homothelimaco, had seen a ship flying the Union Jack anchored off of St. Mark's. This was a ruse. It was an American ship. The two Indians approached the ship and were captured by the U.S. They were brought ashore and hanged without a trial. From St. Mark's, Jackson headed towards the Suwannee River to attack Native American villages. These villages were primarily occupied by fugitive slaves. On April 12th, the Army found a Red Stick village on the Econfina River and attacked. 40 Red Sticks were killed, and around 100 women and children were captured. Elizabeth Stewart was found in the village. She was the woman who was captured in the attack on the supply boats on the Apalachicola River the previous November. The villages on the Suwannee were empty. Many of the black Seminoles had escaped to Tampa Bay, to the Maroon community of Angola. By this point, General Jackson declared victory. He had the Georgia militiamen and the Lower Creek sent home. The remaining army returned to Fort St. Mark's. Robert Ambrister, who was a former officer in the Corps of Colonial Marines, was captured by Jackson's troops. Jackson held a military tribunal at St. Mark's, and Ambrister and Arbuthnot were charged with aiding the Seminoles and the Spanish, inciting them to war and leading them against the United States. Arbuthnot maintained his innocence, stating that he had only engaged in legal trade. The tribunal sentenced both men to death, but Ambrister's sentence was changed to 50 lashes and a year of hard labor. Jackson, however, reinstated Ambrister's death penalty, and he was executed by a firing squad on April 29, 1818. Arbuthnot was hanged on the mast of his own ship. General Jackson left a garrison at Fort St. Mark's, and he returned to Fort Gadsden. He reported all was peaceful and that he would be returning home to Nashville. But soon he changed his mind, and he reported that Indians were gathering and being supplied by the Spanish. He left the fort with 1,000 men on May 7th, headed for Pensacola. The governor of West Florida protested, stating that most of the Indians were women and children and that the men were unarmed, but Jackson would not listen. Jackson also wrote a letter to George Campbell that the seizure of supplies meant for Fort Crawford gave additional reason for the march to Pensacola. On May 23rd, he finally reached Pensacola. The governor and 175 Spanish soldiers that had been garrisoned to guard the city retreated to Fort Broncos. This left Pensacola completely unguarded, and Jackson just walked into the city. The two sides exchanged cannon fire for days. Finally, the Spanish surrendered Fort Barrancas on May 28th. Jackson left Colonel William King as military governor of West Florida and went home. This is completely nuts. He was ordered by the U.S. government to go in and take care of the Indian problem, and he goes right to the forts. He goes to the Spanish forts, finds British subjects, murders them, goes through, burns all the Indian villages. When he says he's finally done, he starts heading up. Nope. I hear that Pensacola is overtaken by Native Americans, and I'm going to go rescue them. He was under strict orders to not do this. That's why people were terrified of the repercussions that were going to happen. There were international repercussions to Jackson's actions. The Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, had already started negotiations with Spain for the purchase of Florida. Spain protested the invasion and seizure of West Florida and suspended the negotiations. Spain was in decline and did not have the means to retaliate against the United States or have the forces to regain West Florida by force. Then Adams issued a letter claiming that the United States was defending her national interest against British, Spanish, and Native Americans. He apologized for the seizure of West Florida, said that it had not been American policy to seize Spanish territory, and offered to give St. Mark's and Pensacola back to Spain. Spain accepted this after a time. They resumed negotiation for the sale of Florida. Adams defended Jackson's actions as necessary. He figured this would strengthen his diplomatic standing. Adams demanded that Spain either control the inhabitants of East Florida or cede it to the United States. An agreement was reached. Spain ceded East Florida to the United States and renounced all claim to West Florida. The British government protested the execution of its two countrymen, who had never entered the United States territory, but Britain refused to risk another war with the United States, and it needed to trade with the United States for the sake of its economy. There were also repercussions in America. A number of congressional hearings were held into the executions of Ambrister and Arbuthnot. Most Americans supported General Jackson, but others were horrified that Jackson might become another Napoleon and transform the United States into a military dictatorship. Congress reconvened in December 1818. Resolutions were introduced condemning General Jackson, but Jackson was too popular. They failed. But the executions of the two British subjects tarnished his reputation for the rest of his life. Ultimately, it didn't really matter because he eventually became president a few years later. The results of Jackson's invasion into Florida was Spain ceded Florida to the United States in 1819 with the Adams-Orange Treaty. The United States took possession in 1821. General Jackson was appointed military governor in March 1821. He arrived in Pensacola in July. He resigned his post in September and returned home in October, spending just 3 months in Florida. The Seminoles were still a severe problem for the new Florida government. John Bell, Provisional Secretary of the Florida Territory, prepared an estimate of the number of Indians in Florida. He reported around 22,000 Indians and 5,000 slaves held by Indians. He estimated 2/3 of them were refugees from the Creek War. In 1823, the government settled the Seminoles on a reservation in the central part of Florida. The Treaty of Moultrie Creek was signed, and the U.S. was obligated to protect the Seminoles as long as they remained law-abiding. As white settlers started moving into North Florida, they began encroaching closer and closer onto the reservation. The Seminoles were short of food, and hunting had declined on the reservation. The Seminoles started wandering off to get food. In 1828, Andrew Jackson, the old enemy to the Seminole Indians, was elected President of the United States of America. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which he promoted. This was to resolve the Native American problems by moving the Seminoles and other tribes west of the Mississippi to Indian Territory. In 1832, the Treaty of Payne's Landing was negotiated. It called for the Seminoles to move west. They were to move west by 1835. What happened next? Well, we've already made a video on it. Go check it out, the Dade Massacre. I'll try to put it up here in the corner for you to click on that. Crazy story. I'll leave it at that. Y'all can watch that video. It is a hell of a story, and I'm surprised it is not known by more people. And that is the invasion of General Jackson into Spanish Florida. General Jackson, here he is, the hero of the War of 1812, the savior of New Orleans. He's ordered by the U.S. government to go down and take care of these Seminole Indians. That's his orders, to go down and stop the Native American problem in Florida. Stop the Native Americans from basically, in their minds, stealing the slaves into Florida for their own. They weren't. The slaves were running off the plantation and getting freed by going into Florida. But Jackson had his own agenda, and that's why people were terrified that he would become another Napoleon. And ultimately, he kind of did. I mean, he became president of the United States. He was duly elected, he didn't completely take over, but yes, back in the day, generals all the time became president. It's kind of what happened. General Washington, General Jackson, General Grant. I hope you enjoyed. It's just a crazy story. I wanted to share it with you. Very not well known about how Florida became into the possession of the United States. Amazing history, and I hope you enjoyed. We will see you on the next. Peace.